So two words I want to use today, Neo-Medievalism and Neo-Catharism. Neo-Medievalism is referring to the medieval situation where morality was essentially locked in. You couldn't legislate morality. Neo-Catharism refers to those movements, those elements that wanted to rebel against this locked-in morality. And we look at the current situation, it's inverted. So whether the Cathars were slandered, what they actually practiced, it's a little bit ambiguous. But some of the things they were purported to have done was, they would practice celibacy, they had this female empowerment thing going on, they were interested in veganism. So if you look at the contemporary situation, you'd say, oh, we've come full circle, we've come to a point where now the Cathars don't seem so bad, they seem normal, they actually seem to be the majority and to have power. Now, of course, the majority of people are not vegans, but veganism as an intellectual moral movement has, it sort of has the power on its side. People are not in power, people are not speaking out against the vegans. So, with that being the case, the other thing I want to look at is the neo-medieval aspect. And people have this concept of absolutism and aristocracy and monarchy that the sovereign could just do whatever he wanted. That wasn't actually the case. You could not legislate morality. There are very few places where you could. One of those few places was with the Jewish community. A sovereign could pretty much legislate whatever he wanted to do. He could kick them out, he could expel them, he could persecute them, or he could take loans from them, he could house them in a certain street or ghetto, he could provide them with protection. So he had a lot of leeway with the Jewish community because the Jewish community was not really connected in with the Christian church, and it wasn't really connected in with the moral geography of the landscape. So it was this separate component in a way that when we talk about legislating morality, the relationship between the Jewish community and the aristocracy becomes the defining aspect of the quote-unquote liberal tradition. I would really say the post-Protestant tradition, because the Protestant tradition is really when you unlock these megalithic structures. Megalith just means big rock. So think of metaphorically in your mind, the church is a big rock. It's very hard to move the church. The church is locked in because of the system. It has this institution. It is not willing to change on issues of morality. Now, the church did slowly change over time, and things like priestly celibacy. But it was very difficult to legislate. It was difficult for a pope to step in and say, okay, no more priestly marriage. Well, that was happening with, Gregory the Seventh back in the 12th century, or the 11th century. And that wasn't actually able to be accomplished for several centuries after. We still have records of priests marrying one another. So it's very difficult to implement. There was a lot of resistance. So again, there's this megalithic structure to the sociality. The social center is not within the scope of a single pope or a single aristocrat, but it's this bigger conservative traditional societal force that has all these interlocking parts, and it's very difficult to coordinate all those parts to actually create a shift. We look at all kinds of different developments and social movements within Europe, and we see this. So when I talk about neo-medievalism, we are looking at a new kind of structuralism. It might be a good way to put it. Now, I'm sure there are many, many definitions of structuralism out there. And the issue is that I'm not really referring to those definitions. I'm also multitasking, so that's always good. And let's finish that up. It's too bad I can't pause the video. So the structuralism I'm referring to is just a situation which the structure itself is what's in power. There's no individual who can come along like a Donald Trump or a Martin Luther or someone who can just come and just revolutionize the scene and do everything on his own because he is the sovereign power. It's not the case in medieval times. You actually look at the king of a kingdom did not have a lot of power to change laws. Again, there are very few aspects of society that he could directly impact with sole authority and sovereignty. He could change laws concerning the Jewish community. He couldn't say, okay, abortions are legal now. Or he couldn't say, okay, gay marriage is legal. He couldn't just legislate morality, even if he wanted to. He couldn't do that because he would be treated in the same way that the Cathars were. And the Cathars did have the support of local princes. And the Cathars, they survived for a time, but they survived under heavy pressure in the same way you might think of apartheid South Africa or apartheid Rhodesia, that you had these states which are under this huge international pressure. And that's the way that the Cathar kingdoms were. They had these little Cathar principalities, and they were always under this international pressure from other European states and from the Catholic Church. And ultimately they didn't survive, but we could say today there's been some sort of revival. So, in the end, maybe the Cathars won in the end. And now we have a Neo-Cathar, Neo-Medievalism, where the tables have turned. We went from being anti-Cathar in our medieval times, now we are pro-Cathar in our neo-medieval times. And again, that word neo-medieval is referring to the structuralism of medieval times. We can always think back to that and use that as a historical precedent for what's happening now, but we have to understand there's a huge misconception when we talk about the medieval form of government. Obviously, in a medieval form of government, the people have no voice, they have no democratic power, but at the same time, the rulers don't have infinite flexibility. The state is not just an extension of their will. The state is a set of interlocking fiefdoms and really loyalty oaths when it comes down to it. People would make these interlocking vows of loyalty to one another up this hierarchical chain. And if you stepped out of bounds, the whole system would come crashing down around you. So there wasn't this infinite flexibility that we said, oh, the king can just legislate anything he wants, he can make up crazy laws. He could on the fringes. He could with respect to the Jewish community. He could with respect to his palace. He could execute anyone he wanted within his palace. But he couldn't just, he could not delegate authority effectively to rule local principalities. Those were ruled by the princes, and the princes were restricted by what the church thought was okay and what tradition thought was okay. So he could be negative, and there were a lot of executions going on. He could be negative. He could say, this is illegal. If you do this, we kill you. Of course, then you have to have methods of detection, and as we all know, police forces cannot effectively police a population unless the population consents to that law. So you can come up with some kind of crazy law and then let him enforce that. So if he says, if your chicken makes a noise on a Saturday, we're going to kill you. Okay, well, good luck having your little force of knights go out to police the population, find out whose chickens are clucking on Saturdays. So making up crazy laws doesn't really work in that situation. You're locked in. You're defined by the limits of enforcement. I mean, you'd have a force of knights, but these knights would be small, and they would really not be used for internal policing of the community. Really, the purpose of the knights would be more so protecting the community from external brigands, as well as in case there was some kind of external campaign, a crusade, war between nation-states in an early formulation at this time, kingdoms. You would offer up your knights so that they could fight on behalf of the kingdom. So not really a local policing force. I mean, they still had to be there for enforcement of law and order on a local level. But basically, if you did something and the church wasn't on your side and the community wasn't on your side, very difficult to legislate morality. Now, when we move into democracy, it becomes very easy to legislate morality because there's this myth of democracy that whatever the people vote for is what they want. So if the people vote for a guy and he changes the law, there's this assumption on everyone's part that he's not legislating morality, the people are legislating morality, and that justifies the legislation of morality. Something you don't get in a medieval aristocratic context where there's no assumption that this legislation of morality is going to actually be impactful, is actually going to work. There is an assumption within a democratic context that the legislation of morality is ultimately backed up by the people, even if it's not. So, you can pass all kinds of laws in a Republican context, I mean, a parliamentary context, better term. You can pass all kinds of laws which people don't support, but because they're all elected officials, then it has the guise of being popularly supported. So when I say we're moving into a neo-medieval context, that democratic notion that whatever the politicians do is supported by the population, that notion is going away. And instead it's being replaced by a kind of structuralism. We understand that you cannot assail gay rights because gay rights are fundamental to liberalism. Not that everything is built off the edifice of gay rights, but that gay rights are a canary in the coal mine. Gay rights symbolize consumption, lack of reproduction, the freedom of choice, etc., etc. So the reasons why people attack gay rights, those reasons are harmful to the fundamentals of liberalism, and therefore it's the canary in the coal mine. They have to be protected. And no one person, like a religious figure, a Father Coughlin, a Donald Trump, doesn't matter. No one person can assail that structure. You can exist as a Cathar in the hinterlands and practice your own weird spirituality, which is a kind of inversion of Catharism. But ultimately, you can't assail the structure itself. It's a megalithic structure. It's a big stone. You can't move it. It's too big for any one person to deal with. So that is the kind of neo-medieval structuralism we're moving into, where no single politician can change the morality. We can no longer legislate morality. Morality is being dictated on high. Now we are in a transition period, where morality is still shifting, still moving. And so we feel as if morality is being legislated. But it's only being legislated in one direction. It's very predictable. And that's why I view it as it is being implemented through legislation. But ultimately, it is not something that we can change the course of through legislation. Legislation is only working in one direction here, because when we legislate gay marriage, when we legislate trans rights, when we legislate these things, we are legislating them in tune with liberalism, and liberalism is the religion of elites. When I say that, I'm not saying that they believe it uncynically or that they believe it straightforwardly. There is an esoteric justification when they view liberalism as a product to sell to the masses, rather than something that they personally live a liberal life. Obviously, Harvey Weinstein promoted feminism for the masses. He didn't practice it in his personal life. So many cases, many such cases. So I'm not saying that they believe liberalism in the sense that they practice it in their own personal life, but they believe that liberalism is the best religion to push onto the masses for themselves to have a good, stable rule. So that's the religion. It's not going away. Legislation can only pass which is in confluence with the religion of liberalism. No legislation can ever pass which is against that. And to the extent that anything is passed, it's going to be superficial. It's going to be a Band-Aid. It's going to be something to appease the masses, to calm people down. And then underneath, there's going to be all kinds of activity to push things in the exact opposite direction. So this is the neo-medieval situation we find ourselves in, sort of in the place of Cathars, just structurally, not ideologically, but structurally. We're in the place of Cathars if we're not on board with the liberal religion. And, you know, again, the Cathars struggled for centuries and centuries to have some form of independence. They could never separate. They could never successfully, you know, escape the oppression of the Catholic Church. And you could say maybe they finally succeeded through the Protestants and the Freemasons and liberalism, really, that they've now succeeded after, you know, many centuries or up to 1,000 years. It's a very old movement. And so if you find yourself in the position of a Cathar, structurally, not ideologically, structurally, then you have to understand that you know, the people who are previously in your position who are now in power, it took them centuries, if not 1,000 years, to get out of that situation, to come to a place of independence and power. And so, the first thing I would assume, barring changes in technology, I would say, okay, well, you're probably going to be under oppression for centuries, if not 1,000 years. The thing that changes that is the internet. Of course, now the internet is being heavily regulated, censored. We see this in China. It's coming to America. And censorship is very effective. So the idea that the internet is this Gutenberg press that's going to change the whole social game, that's going to shorten centuries into a span of minutes and hours, I don't know if that's actually going to work out. So the situation is very volatile. But as far as legislation, there's no legislation coming to protect your free speech. In fact, quite the opposite. Legislation is coming to take away your free speech, effectively. Because liberalism, again, it's about freedom of choice, but it's about freedom of choice to be a consumer, freedom of choice to be non-reproductive, freedom of choice to fulfill base instincts, and not to, contemplate God or something like that. So that kind of freedom of choice is a little bit different. And it's again, when we use these terms, there's a cynical side of it, and then there is the side that is sold, and some people, embrace it wholeheartedly and identify as liberals. We always have to distinguish between the two, but they're interrelated, and there's a feedback between the two, that you have to have true believers, and then you also have people who are cynical promoters of it, and then you have people who don't like it, but they just go along with it. They tolerate it. You have people who try to resist it ineffectively, and then people who go and live in the woods, and all these different strata. It's necessary to have an equilibrium between all these different strata of society in order for the system to work. They all play their own little role in holding up the edifice. So that's what I mean by neo-medievalism. The Neo-Catharism is a little bit confusing because it's like, are you referring to the current elite, or are you referring to oppressed minority ideologies? What are we referring to here when we see Neo-Catharism? I would say there's an aspect of both in both. That obviously, structurally, right-wing people are the Neo-Cathars, but ideologically, the elite is a Neo-Cathar group. So that's got to be worked out. The semantics there aren't as clean as I would like, but neo-medievalism just definitely an important concept to keep in mind when we're thinking about this. Definitely, the 30 Years' War was the explosion of the Protestant Reformation versus the Catholic Church, a very bloody war. 30% of Central Europeans in certain geographical regions were just being totally exterminated. So obviously, a very bloody war, and something like that could happen again. But remember, the roots of that Protestant Reformation are the Cathars. Cathars struggling for hundreds of years to revolt, to gain independence, to gain sovereignty. They didn't get it for hundreds of years. After that process had finally matriculated, they were able to break out, which resulted in this huge war. So ultimately, I agree that when you have a neo-medievalist or just a medieval structural locked-in megalithic morality that can't legislate morality, you can't change, you can't evolve, you're on a one track, and there's no deviation allowed. Obviously, it will take centuries to break out of it, but once you finally break out of it, it's going to be a huge bloody war. So I agree ultimately that, big wars like World War I, World War II, 30 Years' War, all these kinds of wars, the Han Hakka War in China in the 19th century, all of these wars are extremely bloody, extremely catastrophic, and they do signal social change. But these wars take really, in a sense, hundreds of years to develop if we're talking about 30 Years' War specifically. Maybe not World War I, World War II, Napoleonic Wars, but 30 Years' War specifically, that kind of a war that is almost an ideological war. There's a geopolitical aspect to it, but there's an ideological underpinning, there's a religious underpinning. I think that's the right way to think about it. So it's not going to happen, I think, as fast as people think it's going to happen. It is true that, the end of history is not here. There are still big wars to come. But the question is, are they going to be in the next 20 years or the next 200 years? That's a big question. And that time scale results in different strategies. Are you going to start prepping for civil war? If it's in the next 200 years, probably not. You're just going to live your life. Whereas if it's in the next 20 years, you're going to have a different individual strategy. So it is relevant to people's personal lives. And understanding things in this historical context, the internet allows social change to happen faster, but it also allows for new methods of social control and allows for the elite to exercise their power in a new way, whereas I said previously the aristocracy could not change the morality of the serf class instantaneously. They could not legislate morality. Now with the internet you can engineer morality, which is very powerful, through entertainment, through media. So, you know, I guess there's +1 to the serf class, but also +1 to the elite, and it's kind of a question of whose +1 wins out. It's obviously a different dynamic, but it's not just, the internet doesn't just benefit the serf class. The internet also really benefits the elite and their ability to disseminate new ideas which benefit them from the top down through things like Netflix, through things like Hollywood, etc. You're able to do that much more effectively than you were when you had the old medievalism of Europe. It's very difficult to change people's opinions. That's all. Thank you. Bye-bye.